The chamber was cold. Though heavy drapes sealed the windows and braziers glowed in the corners, the air inside the residence in Munich carried a dampness, as if the very stones of the palace had begun to sweat with fear. Candles trembled in their holders, their thin flames snapping and guttering each time a shout from beyond the palace walls reached inside. The shouts came in waves, harsh voices of men, shriller cries of women, the pounding rhythm of boots and fists upon the iron gates. The sound was not that of loyal subjects. It was the roar of revolt, of betrayal, of a people come to demand the blood of their sovereign. In the centre of this chamber sat King Ludwig I of Bavaria. He was 60 years old, but that evening he seemed ancient, a frail monument draped in velvet. His once straight back was bent, his crown set aside on a table where its jewels flickered in the candlelight like the eyes of carrion birds. His hands that had signed edicts, funded cathedrals, and commissioned masterpieces, trembled uncontrollably. He pressed them against the arms of his chair as if he might steady the world itself. The king's courtiers had deserted him. Ministers had warned him, begged him, and finally abandoned him. His own children had spoken against him. The mob outside howled not only for reforms, not only for liberty, but for her expulsion, her destruction, her banishment from Bavaria. Her name was whispered like an incantation, a curse spat into the night air. Lola Montez. The king shut his eyes against the noise, but she appeared there too, behind his eyelids. A face both angelic and cruel, dark hair tumbling in loose wild curls, lips parted in a smile that promised both ecstasy and ruin. He heard her laughter, that low Andalusian laugh that had first reached him like music from some forbidden instrument. He remembered her eyes blue-grey, not the black eyes she claimed as a Spaniard, but eyes that could burn like coals when angered. He had given her everything, titles, jewels, a palace of her own, and power enough to bend ministers to her will. And in return, she had given him not only her beauty, but her defiance, her fire, her whip-crack temper that made him feel for the first time in years like a man still alive. Now she was the ruin of him. The mob knew her not as a courtesan or dancer, but as a witch, a succubus, a corrupter of kings. Pamphlets compared her to Jezebel, to Delilah, to the whore of Babylon. Students cursed her name in beer halls. Caricaturists sketched her with fangs and claws. Each insult thrown at her landed upon Ludwig as well, until the line between the king and his mistress blurred. To hate Lola was to hate Ludwig, and to hate Ludwig was to hate the monarchy itself. He opened his eyes again. Shadows flickered against the chamber walls. Somewhere in the palace a door slammed. Footsteps echoed, servants fleeing before the palace was stormed. Ludwig drew a long, shuddering breath and whispered her name, Lola. And so we begin. Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, the woman who would rename herself Lola Montez and weave the web that ensnared a king, was born in 1821, far from these Bavarian chambers, in the damp green lands of Ireland. Yet it was not Ireland that shaped her first, but India. Her father, a soldier, carried his young family to the subcontinent when Eliza was still small, and there, amid the heat and the dust, she first learned what it was to be restless. When fever carried him to an early grave, her mother remarried quickly and shipped Eliza back to Britain, a wild child ill-suited to the stiff manners of Victorian guardians. She did not bow easily, did not whisper when told, did not sit with folded hands like the other girls. She had a streak in her, a spirit too sharp, too untamed. By 16, scandal had already found her. A marriage entered in haste, a union broken almost as soon as it began. Society whispered, a ruined girl, a disgrace, but disgrace. To Eliza was not a chain, it was an invitation. If the world would not forgive her, she would simply invent a new self the world could not ignore. She would shed Eliza Gilbert like a snake's skin. She would become Lola Montez, and Lola Montez was no Irish runaway, no shameful bride. She was a Spanish dancer, born of sun and fire, her blood hot with Andalusian rhythm. She studied the turns, the poses, the sharp flick of a fan, and when she stepped upon a stage, she set audiences aflame, not with technical grace, but with daring. She danced the spider dance, a performance half ritual, half seduction, in which she feigned to brush venomous creatures from her skirts, lifting them higher and higher as if to tease the very edge of propriety. Men roared, women gasped, Priests denounced her from pulpits, and Lola smiled through it all, for scandal was the true currency of her art. She danced across Europe, Paris, Vienna, Warsaw, leaving behind her broken hearts and furious wives, debts unpaid and jewels narrowly escaped. She did not merely perform, she conquered. And each conquest brought her closer to the halls of power. She supped with writers, quarrelled with painters, entangled herself with noblemen and officers. A new city meant a new scandal, but also a higher rung upon the ladder, and in 1846 her wandering brought her to Munich. Munich, jewel of Bavaria, city of students and churches, of beer halls and poets, of a people proud yet restless. Here reigned King Ludwig I, patron of the arts, dreamer of marble statues and frescoed palaces, a monarch with a poet's heart and an old man's loneliness. He was devoted to beauty, not merely the abstract beauty of architecture and painting, but the living beauty of women. He had filled galleries with portraits of Munich's fairest maidens, declaring them his gallery of beauties. Yet all the painted faces blurred together in his mind until the day Lola Montez strode into his path. She did not curtsy. She did not lower her eyes. She looked at him directly, boldly, with that half-smile curling her lips as if she knew him already, as if she had come to claim him. And Ludwig, king though he was, felt suddenly the trembling awe of a moth before a flame. Now, in this chamber thick with smoke and fear, as the mob outside thundered for her downfall, Ludwig clutched his head and rocked forward in his chair. He remembered the first time she laughed in his ear, the first time she slapped a minister in his presence, the first time he watched her dance and felt his court stiffen in outrage. He remembered their whispers, "Sire, she is dangerous. Sire, she is a fraud. Sire, she is destroying you." He had silenced them all. For Lola had become more than mistress, more than dancer, more than scandal. She was the very pulse of his withered heart. Without her, he felt he would crumble to dust. With her, he could endure the scorn of the world. But now, the world was at his gates. The candles hissed as if mocking him. The roar of the crowd grew louder, closer, rolling like thunder that promised lightning to follow. Somewhere deep in the palace, the great doors groaned as soldiers struggled to hold them shut. Ludwig rose, his knees weak beneath him. He tottered toward the table where his crown lay glimmering in the half-light. He reached out a hand, but did not touch it. Instead, his fingers hovered, trembling, before he let them fall. What use was a crown when one's kingdom was already lost to a woman's smile? And so begins the tragedy of Lola Montez and King Ludwig I, a tale not of battlefields and armies, but of passion turned poison, of desire wielded as a weapon, of a monarch ensnared not by generals or diplomats, but by a dancer's daring. She was called temptress, destroyer, witch. He was called fool, puppet, madman. Together, they danced upon the stage of history, until the ground itself cracked beneath them. The mob outside screamed louder still, and the palace quaked with the sound. In the shadows of the chamber, Ludwig closed his eyes once more and whispered the name that had doomed him. Lola. And outside, as if in answer, the crowd roared it back, their voices a storm that would topple a throne. The web was spun, the spider waited, and Bavaria trembled. The night sky over Limerick in 1821 was heavy with rain, the kind that soaks through wool and stone alike, muting the world into a grey silence. In a small house near the River Shannon, a child first drew breath, her cry sharp and urgent as though announcing not only her arrival but her refusal ever to be ignored. She was christened Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, daughter to Edward Gilbert, a British officer, and his young wife Elizabeth. Though she had entered a modest household, her destiny would not remain bound by walls or expectation. Already, whispers in the neighbourhood called her restless, difficult, ungovernable. They could not know how true those whispers would one day prove. Her father's commission carried the family far from Ireland. When Eliza was still a girl, they sailed to India, that jewel of the empire where the air shimmered with heat and the nights pulsed with drumming. Here, amid the chaos of Calcutta, her senses first awakened to a world unshaped by English manners. The markets smelled of spice and sweat, elephants lumbered through narrow streets, and women in bright silks walked with a freedom that dazzled her. Yet her time in this vibrant place was brief. Fever claimed her father when she was only 2, and with his death came exile back to Britain. She was placed into the care of guardians, relatives, instructors who sought to tame her. But Eliza was not made to be tamed. She was willful, loud, quick to laughter, quicker to fury. Governesses despaired at her sharp tongue, her refusal to stitch, her habit of slipping from lessons to run wild in the fields. She possessed a beauty already evident, dark hair that refused to stay bound, a face that carried both mischief and defiance, yet it was her eyes that unnerved those around her. They were not the soft, lowered eyes of a docile maiden, but direct, piercing, too aware. They looked at you as if they demanded something you could not name, as if she already knew her future was not to be written by another's hand. England at the time demanded obedience from its daughters. Girls were meant to be modest, chaste, pliant. They were commodities to be bargained for in marriage, their worth measured in dowries and docility. But Eliza spat at such notions. She laughed too loudly, rode horses with reckless abandon, argued with tutors, and flaunted her disregard for propriety. Rumours spread she was wild, unruly, a girl who would bring shame to any family that tried to contain her. By 16, her rebelliousness erupted into scandal. In a rash act of defiance, she eloped with Lieutenant Thomas James, an officer of little fortune and less sense. The marriage was hasty, carried out in secret, and as doomed as any written by passion and rebellion alone. Within months, the union collapsed. The reasons were whispered: his cruelty, her volatility, both true enough, but society did not care for nuance. A broken marriage was a stain that could never be scrubbed clean. Eliza was marked, a ruined woman before she had even reached adulthood. Her name became a sneer in drawing rooms. Respectable households barred their doors. Mothers warned their sons of her, though the young men themselves were often drawn like moths to her reckless flame. In an era where a woman's virtue was her only currency, Eliza had spent hers recklessly, and now she was left penniless in reputation if not in purse. Yet she did not weep or retreat. She did not bend her head in shame as society expected. Instead, she looked upon her disgrace with a kind of exhilaration. If she could not be accepted, she would be notorious. If they would not call her wife, they would call her something else, entirely something unforgettable. Already she sensed it, the power of scandal, how a single act could echo louder than years of obedience. She had tasted ruin and found it intoxicating. But Eliza Gilbert was a name too small for the destiny she craved. It belonged to a girl bound by British law and Victorian judgment. She needed something else, something exotic, dangerous, unforgettable. She would remake herself in fire and shadow. She would become a woman unmoored from birthplace, freed from past disgrace, impossible to contain. Thus, the seeds of Lola Montez were planted in the ashes of Eliza's first scandal. Years later, when she took to the stage and claimed to be a Spanish dancer from Andalusia, few would remember the Irish girl who once ran laughing across wet fields and cursed her governesses. They would know only Lola, a creature of flame and defiance, whose dance shocked and seduced in equal measure. But here, in the ruins of her teenage marriage, in the moment she turned her back on the life she had been given, the transformation truly began. Legends later embroidered her early years, as legends always do. Some claimed she had been wild from birth, tearing ribbons from her dress and stomping her feet like a gypsy child. Others whispered of an Indian nurse who had filled her head with strange tales, planting within her a spirit alien to English restraint. Truth and myth blurred, as they always would around her. But the undeniable fact was this: Eliza Rosanna Gilbert had chosen never again to be small, never again to be silent. If the world would not grant her a place, she would seize one. If her name was tarnished, she would forge a new one. If propriety was a cage, she would break it. Those who knew her in these years recalled her laugh loud, fearless, tinged with something almost mocking. It was the laugh of a girl already learning that shame had no power over her, that once you embraced the worst they could call you, you became untouchable. It was the laugh that would one day echo through the palaces of Europe and drive ministers to fury, the laugh that would haunt the chambers of a Bavarian king. For now, she was still Eliza, but not for long. The world had already begun to tremble at her footsteps, though it did not yet know her name, and somewhere, in the shadows of history, the web was already waiting. The end of her marriage was not marked by ceremony, but by silence. Lieutenant Thomas James abandoned her, as one might abandon a burden too heavy to bear. There were no passionate farewells, no dramatic confrontations, only the slow realization that she had been left to drift, unwanted and unprotected. In Victorian Britain, Abandonment was a harsher punishment than any blow. A woman without a husband was a woman without anchor, her very presence an embarrassment in the parlours of the respectable. For Eliza, the shame was compounded by whispers that she had not simply been left, but that she had deserved it. She was too wild, too sharp-tongued, too unwilling to play the part of meek wife. The gossip spread like ink spilled across parchment. It stained her every interaction. Old friends turned away, doors closed. Suitors avoided her, as if the taint of her failure might cling to them. For most women, such ruin would have been a death sentence of the spirit. They would retreat, fade into the grey corners of society, endure their days in quiet resignation. But Eliza was made of iron disguised in flesh. Instead of breaking, she began to see the contours of her own defiance more clearly. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and asked herself whether she would live shackled to disgrace, or whether she would refashion that disgrace into something more potent. Each day, she grew less like the Eliza her guardians had tried to raise, and more like the shadow of the woman she was destined to become. The storm within her sharpened into resolve. If society branded her fallen, then she would rise as something far more dangerous than respectable. She would rise as unforgettable. There are stories, half-truths embroidered into legend of how she practiced in her room before the mirror, swaying her hips with the strange rhythms she remembered from India, lifting her skirts just enough to scandalize the air itself. She would laugh at her reflection, daring it to be shocked. She would pretend the room was a theatre, and that she was already Lola, already the woman who would make kings tremble. Whether these stories are fact or fancy scarcely matters. What is certain is that her transformation was no accident. It was deliberate, chosen, willed into being. By her late teens, she had shed the skin of Eliza Gilbert almost entirely in spirit, though the name had not yet changed. She walked with a boldness unusual for a woman, chin lifted, eyes blazing with challenge. Men watched her with fascination tinged with fear. Women whispered of her impropriety and secretly envied her lack of restraint. She was neither wife nor widow, neither maiden nor matron, but something liminal, something unsettling, and in that space between categories, she found freedom. It was then that the first whispers of reinvention stirred in her imagination. Spain fascinated her, land of fire and dance, of gypsies and duels, of freedom far removed from the suffocating propriety of London parlours. She did not speak the language, nor had she ever set foot in Andalusia, but she understood instinctively that identity was not a matter of birthplace but of performance. She would craft a new self as easily as one might don a costume. If her Irish blood and British scandal shackled her, then she would abandon them both and take on a mask woven of passion and danger. Yet even as this vision formed, she remained a girl standing in the ruins of her first life, smouldering with resentment against the world that had condemned her. That resentment became the fuel of her reinvention. Each insult, each door slammed in, her face, each hissed whisper of fallen woman hardened her resolve. If they thought her dangerous, she would become dangerous. If they thought her shameless, she would strip shame from her vocabulary entirely. If they believed her unworthy of respect, she would command something greater, fear and fascination. And so, out of a broken marriage and a sullied reputation, Lola Montez began to stir a phantom at first, born in mirrors and daydreams, but soon to step onto the stage of Europe with skirts swirling, eyes flashing, and a laugh that echoed like the crack of a whip. The making of Lola was not an accident. It was an act of war against a world that had tried to bury Eliza Gilbert alive. The girl who had been Eliza Gilbert vanished in fragments. One day it was the name, dropped like a stone into dark waters. Another day it was the accent, softened and twisted into something unfamiliar, with just enough foreign rhythm to intrigue and confuse. Then it was the clothing, silks in bright reds, flowing skirts heavy with fringe, mantillas pinned with jewelled combs. Bit by bit, she killed the ghost of the Irish girl shamed by a broken marriage and brought forth something new, something far more dangerous than polite society could ever contain. When she next looked into the mirror, it was not Eliza staring back at her, but Lola Montez. Lola. The name was chosen for its softness on the tongue, its musical allure. Montez, for Spain, though she had never lived there, never even set foot upon Andalusian soil. Spain was not a birthplace, but an invention, a stage upon which she might weave her illusions. And illusions, she was beginning to understand, could be more powerful than truth. Spain, in the imagination of 19th century Europe, was a land of heat, passion, danger. By claiming it, she claimed those qualities for herself. If Eliza was ruined, Lola was untouchable. If Eliza was mocked, Lola was worshipped and feared. Her first steps into performance were hesitant, but she learned quickly. She was not a great dancer by training. Her movements lacked the polish of ballerinas drilled from childhood, but she compensated with boldness, with the sheer audacity of presence. Where others glided gracefully, she stamped. Where others turned demurely, she flung her arms wide and let her hair fall loose. What she lacked in technique, she replaced with ferocity, and audiences did not come to see skill. They came to be shocked, to be scandalized, to glimpse a woman who defied every cage that society tried to build. She discovered her weapon almost by accident. A performance in Paris, the city of decadence, of absinthe and whispers, gave birth to her most infamous creation. The stage lights burned low, the musicians struck a rhythm heavy with menace, and Lola began a dance unlike any seen before. She bent low, her eyes darting downward, her hands brushing urgently at her skirts. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she lifted them, inch by inch, higher than propriety allowed, revealing not only ankles but calves, knees, thighs. She twirled, stamped, brushed again at her clothing, as if some invisible horror crawled upon her, and then it became clear. She was ridding herself of spiders. The spider dance. It was grotesque, comic, and erotic all at once. She flung her skirts aside in mock terror, stamped furiously as though crushing the unseen creatures. Each movement seemed both accidental and deliberate, a game of showing and concealing. The audience gasped, then laughed, then fell into fevered applause. Critics called it vulgar, priests thundered against its obscenity, but the name Lola Montez passed from lip to lip like a spell. She had discovered the alchemy of scandal. Paris adored her, reviled her, could not ignore her. Aristocrats sent her flowers and poets scribbled odes in her honor. Yet behind the adoration lurked suspicion. Who was she, really? Some claimed she was no Spaniard but an impostor, a mere Irish woman playing at exotica. Others whispered she was not a dancer at all but a courtesan disguising her trade with lace and music. Men laughed as they told stories of her temper, how she carried a whip and struck those who offended her. They feared her as much as they desired her, but Lola understood a truth that others had not yet grasped. To be loved or hated mattered less than to be spoken of. Obscurity was death, notoriety was power. Every pamphlet that mocked her, every caricature that drew her with fangs and claws, every sermon that condemned her as a temptress, all of it fed the legend. The more they despised her, the larger she became. She was not a woman now, but a myth made flesh, a living contradiction of propriety, a mirror reflecting back the secret desires and terrors of a society obsessed with control. Her lovers multiplied. Artists, journalists, noblemen, officers, all tangled in her web. Some she abandoned with cruel laughter, others clung to her until they were ruined. Duels were fought in her name. The more scandal grew, the more doors opened. For even those who condemned her in public longed to see her in private, to witness the fire for themselves. She became a courtesan without ever naming herself one, her performances a screen behind which her influence spread. The spider dance followed her from Paris to Warsaw, from Vienna to Berlin. In every city, it provoked outrage and fascination in equal measure. Mothers pulled daughters from theatres in disgust, yet the daughters whispered about Lola in the dark, imagining the freedom of such audacity. Ministers warned their kings against her, yet those same kings sent invitations. Wherever she went, gossip preceded her like a herald, and scandal followed her like a funeral procession. By the mid-negative 1840 seconds, she was infamous. Her name, once Eliza Gilbert, was now erased. She belonged wholly to Lola Montez, the dancer of shadows, the spider who lured men into her web. Yet notoriety is a hunger that grows with each, feeding. No matter how much applause she received, no matter how many scandals she sparked, she craved more. Paris was conquered, Vienna was scandalized, Warsaw whispered. What remained? The answer lay in Munich, where an aging king with a poet's heart yearned for passion. She had heard the rumours of Ludwig I of Bavaria, his patronage of beauty, his gallery of women, his loneliness. A king who adored beauty would adore Lola, and if a king adored her, she would rise higher than scandal alone could lift her. When she arrived in Munich in 1846, she carried with her more than trunks of costumes. She carried the weight of her legend, the whispers of Europe, the aura of danger that clung to her like perfume. By then, she no longer needed to prove her Spanish blood, her dancing skill, or her respectability. She had transcended truth. She was Lola Montez, the woman no one could resist and no one could forgive, and she was ready to spin her web around a crown. Lola did not move through Europe as other performers did. Most dancers travelled with a company, rehearsed under the guidance of masters, curried favour with respectable impresarios. She travelled like a storm. She arrived without warning, announced herself with boldness, performed as though daring the city to despise her, and vanished in scandal before her debts were paid. Theatre managers both dreaded and longed for her. A Lola engagement meant trouble, unpaid bills, furious wives, newspapers frothing with outrage. Yet it also meant sold-out houses, men queuing in the rain, whispers that electrified salons. Her fame was not built on steps or technique. Ballet mistresses sneered that she could not even hold her posture correctly, that her leaps were ungainly, her rhythm uneven. But the people did not come to watch form. They came to watch her body defy their expectations. They came to see how far she would go, how high the skirts would rise, how shamelessly she would wield her laughter. Each night in the theatre was a duel between her and society's boundaries, and she always emerged triumphant. Her beauty, too, was a matter of debate. She was not classically perfect. Her features were strong, her nose too sharp, her jaw too defiant. Yet when she entered a room, men forgot perfection. They felt instead the jolt of danger, as if they had glimpsed a flame and knew it might burn them if they leaned closer. She cultivated this, magnified it with her walk, her hair, her habit of looking directly into men's eyes until they faltered. Beauty was not symmetry, it was command. And Lola commanded. Of course, her lovers became part of the legend. An officer in Warsaw ruined himself with gambling debts for her. A Viennese nobleman was said to have fought a duel over her, though whether she even remembered his name afterward was doubtful. In Paris, artists painted her, poets praised her, but when they displeased her, she flung insults like daggers. She was known to strike men across the face with her riding whip, leaving them humiliated and yet somehow more enthralled. She did not beg for devotion, she demanded it, and in that demand lay the essence of her power. The line between dancer and courtesan blurred, but she seemed to care little. To some, she was a performer with no real art, using her body as spectacle. To others, she was a courtesan cloaked in the theatre's respectability. But Lola herself treated these distinctions with contempt. She knew the truth. Scandal was its own form of currency, and she spent it lavishly. Whether she was called whore or dancer, temptress or fraud, the only unforgivable fate was to be ignored. And Lola was never ignored. She became, in many ways, the embodiment of Europe's own contradictions. The 1,840 seconds were years of tension, with revolution simmering beneath gilded surfaces. Society preached virtue but hungered for vice, condemned lust but chased after it in shadows. Lola stood upon the stage and forced those shadows into the light. She did what polite women dared not. She spoke what they silenced. She laughed at men who thought themselves masters, and the audience, horrified and thrilled, could not look away. Each city left its mark on her, but none held her for long. She was restless, always hungry for the next stage, the next conquest, the next higher rung of society to scandalize. By the time she looked toward Munich, she was no longer merely a dancer with a notorious act. She was a legend in motion, a rumour given flesh, a name that carried both dread and desire ahead of her. Munich was not Paris nor Vienna. Bavaria was proud, provincial, fiercely Catholic, with a king whose heart beat for art and beauty, but whose people valued obedience and morality. Into that delicate balance Lola Montez would hurl herself like a stone into a still pond. She carried not just her costumes and debts into Munich, but the accumulated scandal of a continent. By the time she set foot in Bavaria, Lola Montez was less a woman than a storm, and storms do not ask permission before they break the sky. The road that carried Lola Montez toward Munich was not paved with cobblestones alone, but with whispers, scandals, and broken reputations. She did not travel lightly. Behind her trailed the shadows of affairs, unpaid debts, duels fought in her name, the smoke of theatres where she had set audiences aflame with outrage and desire. At each stop she was greeted not as a stranger but as a rumour come to life. Men who had only read of her exploits craned their necks to see her with their own eyes. Women who condemned her in salons could not keep their curiosity from pricking at their tongues. Lola Montez was never anonymous. She was a storm announced long before its thunder cracked the sky. In Paris, her name had become legend. She moved in the circles of artists and radicals, drank absinthe in smoke-choked cafes, and flung insults as easily as laughter. Some said she had been the mistress of Franz Liszt, that virtuoso of the piano, who could drive women into fainting fits with his performances. Whether true or false, the story clung to her like perfume, intoxicating, impossible to shake. She relished such rumours. Each one added another layer to her myth, another turn in the web she spun across Europe. In Vienna, she left behind chaos. A nobleman fell under her spell and pursued her with such recklessness that his family disowned him. Another fought a duel, blades flashing in the grey dawn, his blood spilled upon the grass in her name. Lola herself did not linger long enough to care who lived or died. She had no use for men who offered devotion without power. Love was not her goal, ascension was. To captivate, to scandalize, to climb, this was her dance, more dangerous than the spider dance itself. Her temper, as much as her beauty, became infamous. She carried a riding whip and used it without hesitation. When an admirer pressed too close or a critic spoke too loudly, she struck. Caricatures soon appeared in newspapers: Lola with serpent hair, Lola lashing out with her whip, Lola as dominatrix of Europe. But even those images, meant to mock, only deepened her legend. Respectable women tutted and crossed themselves, while men, secretly thrilled, dreamed of feeling the sting of her punishment. She drifted through courts as though testing their strength. At times she seemed like a courtesan seeking patrons, at others like an actress performing in salons where the play was scandal itself. In truth, she was neither and both. She was invention embodied, never still long enough for anyone to pin her down. Aristocrats whispered that she might be a spy, using her allure to draw secrets from ministers' beds. Revolutionaries muttered that she was one of them, mocking the hypocrisy of monarchs from within their gilded halls. Priests declared her a witch, her dancing nothing less than sorcery. To all these accusations, Lola laughed. Every suspicion only widened her power. By 1846, the great capitals of Europe had tasted her fire. And then her gaze turned to Bavaria. Munich was not Paris. It was a city proud of its traditions, steeped in Catholic morality, where students studied theology and artisans built altars as readily as beer steins. Yet beneath the piety smouldered restlessness. The people loved their king, Ludwig I, a patron of art and beauty, but his extravagances had begun to grate. His gallery of beauties, filled with portraits of young women chosen for their loveliness, was whispered about in taverns. The king was aging, his heart still beating like that of a poet, but his body bending with years. He longed for youth, for passion, for something to burn away the shadows creeping in at the edges of his reign. Lola Montez, hearing of him, saw not merely a monarch, but an opportunity. For what greater conquest could there be than a king? She had captivated noblemen and artists, but their influence was crumbs. A crown, even if not placed upon her head, would set her name into history. And Ludwig, with his obsession for beauty and his loneliness gnawing at him, was ripe for the taking. Her arrival in Munich was no accident. She came with her reputation already carried on the wind. The people of Bavaria had heard of her long before she set foot on their soil. They whispered of her in cafes, predicting disaster should she reach their king. Ministers shifted uneasily in their offices, dreading the moment when the tempest of Lola would collide with the vulnerability of Ludwig. But curiosity is stronger than caution, and when she appeared, Munich could not look away. She entered the city with the strut of one who knows the world is already her audience. Her skirts swung with deliberate defiance. Her eyes met those of men and made them falter. Her laughter rang through taverns and salons alike. Within days she was the subject of pamphlets and gossip. Some dismissed her as a fraud, an Irish girl playing at Spanish fire. Others swore she was enchantress incarnate. What none could deny was the effect she had. When at last she contrived to be presented before Ludwig, She did not kneel, did not bow. She looked at him as though he were not a king but a man. That was her greatest weapon. She treated power as though it were hers already. Ludwig, who had spent decades surrounded by courtiers eager to flatter and obey, was struck dumb. Here was a woman who did not tremble in his presence, who did not soften her gaze, who dared to look directly into his eyes and smile. He was 60. She was 25. He was weary of politics, burdened by duty, aching with the knowledge that time was slipping from him. She was restless, reckless, and hungry. Their meeting was less an introduction than a spark finding dry tinder. Within weeks, Munich would seethe with rumours. Within months, Bavaria would tremble. The road to Bavaria was not just a journey across geography. It was the gathering of storm clouds, the weaving of the final strands of a web that had been spun since Eliza Gilbert first chose to destroy her name and become Lola Montez. Paris had given her scandal, Vienna had given her danger, but Munich would give her history. And in Ludwig she saw not just a king, but a throne upon which she could perch like a spider at the heart of her web, pulling at threads until a kingdom shook. The stage was set, the dancer had arrived, and the monarch, trembling with both desire and dread, awaited his fate. The palace air was heavy with incense, drifting from censers as though the church itself had followed the king into his private chambers to remind him of sin. King Ludwig I of Bavaria, poet and monarch, leaned forward on his throne with the nervous anticipation of a schoolboy, awaiting the entrance of a woman who was already notorious before her first curtsy. When Lola Montez stepped into his presence, time stuttered. She did not walk timidly, as other women did when approaching a sovereign. She moved like a flame, uncoiling, her skirts rippling with the stride of a conqueror, her chin tilted so that her gaze met his directly. Those eyes grey-blue, not the dark Andalusian fire she claimed, but fierce and alive, struck him like a blow. Courtiers held their breath. Here was no supplicant. Here was a storm in silk. She did not bow. Instead, she smiled. "Majesty," she said, in a voice low and deliberate, her accent carrying just enough foreign lilt to remind him she was not one of his own. The chamber seemed to lean toward her. Ministers shifted in outrage, the air thick with scandal. But Ludwig did not see them. He saw only her. For a man who had filled entire galleries with portraits of beautiful women, here at last was beauty alive, burning, impossible to frame or contain. He was 60, his hair thinning, his body stiff with age. Yet as Lola stood before him, Ludwig felt a spark return to his veins, as though youth itself had re-entered the room. She was not shy, not demure, not afraid. Where others flattered him, she teased. Where others blushed, she laughed. It was laughter tinged with mockery, daring him to rise to her challenge. And Ludwig, king of Bavaria, found himself not commanding but commanded. It began with conversation. She spoke of Paris, of Vienna, of salons filled with smoke and poetry. She spoke of scandal as though it were a game, her lips curling in delight at the memory of ministers outraged and priests thundering. Ludwig listened, enchanted, his ministers fuming in silence. When she mentioned her dancing, he leaned forward eagerly. When she described her spider dance, he flushed, though whether from shock or desire no one could tell. Within weeks, whispers spread through Munich like wildfire. Lola Montez had ensnared the king. He was seen walking with her in gardens, his arm offered as though she were queen rather than foreign adventuress. He gave her a palace, richly furnished, its windows lit late into the night while Bavaria's ministers waited. In vain for his attention to matters of state, he showered her with jewels, titles, even Bavarian citizenship. She was no longer merely Lola Montez, she was Countess of Landsfeld. The court recoiled. Nobles who had spent their lives clawing for the king's favour now found themselves eclipsed by a woman with no lineage, no legitimacy, only scandal and beauty. Ministers muttered of her temper, her whip, her insults flung like daggers at anyone who crossed her. Priests thundered that Bavaria itself had been defiled, but Ludwig would hear none of it. He defended her with the blindness of obsession. "Lola," he wrote in his diary, "is the truest heart, the fiercest spirit. They do not see her as I do. They do not understand." But what Ludwig saw as devotion, Bavaria saw as disgrace. Lola, for her part, revelled in her new power. She did not content herself with being a mistress hidden in shadows. She strode through the palace as though it were hers, sparring with ministers, mocking nobles, dictating decisions. She spoke politics, though she had no office, whispered advice that Ludwig treated as gospel, and dismissed enemies with the flick of her wrist. To her, the Bavarian court was another stage, and scandal was her choreography. Munich society trembled between horror and fascination. Caricatures appeared in shop windows, depicting her as a spider ensnaring the king, as a witch stirring a cauldron, as Jezebel with a crown at her feet. Students muttered in beer halls, enraged that a foreign woman should wield such power. Wives warned their husbands not to speak her name, though those same husbands lingered too long on her image when the newspapers mocked her. Ludwig ignored it all. He wrote her poetry, compared her to classical heroines, placed her portrait among his cherished gallery of beauties as though her scandal were the same as innocence. Each day he sank deeper into her spell, while each day Bavaria's patience frayed. At night, in her palace rooms, Lola laughed. She was not naive. She knew the hatred gathering like storm clouds outside, but she had never lived for love alone. Love was fleeting. Power was intoxicating. And here she stood, mistress not only to a man but to a king, her name spoken in every tavern and salon, her influence shaping a kingdom. It was the pinnacle of the reinvention she had begun years ago, when Eliza Gilbert died and Lola Montez was born. But every pinnacle is a precipice. And beneath the glow of candlelight, as Ludwig clutched her hand and whispered of eternal devotion, the first cracks in the throne were already spreading. Bavaria would not forgive. The court would not endure. And Lola Montez, for all her daring, could not dance forever without the ground giving way. Still, for the moment, the king and the dancer spun in their own orbit, blind to the ruin they trailed behind them. He believed himself her protector, yet it was she who held him in her web. She believed herself invincible, yet her every step deepened the abyss yawning at her feet. Together, they were not lovers but conspirators, in a tragedy neither could escape. And outside, in the streets of Munich, the people murmured, "This will end in fire." Munich, that city of scholars and craftsmen, felt itself suddenly transformed into a theatre where the most scandalous drama of the age played out before unwilling eyes. Each day brought new whispers of Lola Montez's audacity. She was seen at the opera in a box reserved for royalty, leaning forward with a smirk while respectable matrons turned their heads away. She was spotted riding in the English garden, her skirts scandalously high, her laughter echoing through the trees while Ludwig rode beside her, grinning like a schoolboy in love. She was glimpsed entering ministerial meetings, where no woman of her kind had any place, her presence turning statesmen into stammering schoolboys. She had no patience for deference. When nobles bowed, she mocked their stiffness. When officials disagreed with her, she lashed out with her infamous whip. One story told of her striking a courtier across the face in full view of the king, who did nothing to punish her, but instead offered her his arm, as though she were a queen. Another rumour claimed she once spat at a priest who dared to admonish her for her behaviour. Whether truth or embellishment, the tales multiplied until Lola was less woman than storm, unpredictable, violent and irresistible. Ludwig himself only deepened her legend. He wrote verses in her honour, clumsy but fervent, and commissioned new portraits that captured her in silks, her dark curls tumbling, her gaze alive with defiance. "My Lola," he called her, as though she belonged to him, yet in truth it was he who belonged to her. Ministers despaired, warning him that her influence was poisoning his reign, that Bavaria's people despised her, that riots might follow. He silenced them with a wave of his hand. "You do not see her soul," he insisted. "She is fire, she is truth, she is my salvation. But salvation for a king can be destruction for a kingdom." Students, once loyal to Ludwig, began to shout Lola's name in the streets, not in adoration, but in rage. Pamphlets accused her of espionage, of witchcraft, of draining the treasury with her extravagance. Each denunciation only fueled her notoriety. She seemed untouchable, the woman who could bend a monarch with a glance. At night, in their gilded chambers, Ludwig clung to her like a man drowning. He pressed her hands, kissed her knuckles, swore that he would abdicate his crown before he abandoned her. She listened, her smile sharp as a blade. Perhaps she believed him, perhaps she did not care. For Lola had always known that devotion was fragile, that power was fleeting. Her reign might not last, but while it did, she would burn brightly enough to sear her name into history. yet the palace itself groaned beneath the weight of their passion. Servants gossiped, ministers plotted, students muttered, priests prayed. Outside, Bavaria trembled on the edge of unrest, and in the centre of it all, like a spider at the heart of her web, Lola Montez laughed. The king and the dancer were bound now, not by love alone, but by scandal, obsession, and the inevitability of ruin. Each day that Ludwig clung tighter, Bavaria slipped further from his grasp. And each night, as the candles burned low, the shadow of the coming storm stretched longer across the palace walls. Munich had never seen anything like her. Bavaria had endured wars, famine, revolts, but nothing prepared the city for the daily spectacle of Lola Montez striding through its heart as though she owned it. She was not content to remain a mistress behind silken curtains, hidden in private apartments where the king might visit her in secrecy. She paraded herself openly, daring the citizens to look upon her and choke on their outrage. To her, scandal was not a danger, it was a throne, and she sat upon it with her chin raised high. The people called her many names: Jezebel, Delilah, the Spanish witch, the Irish whore. Pamphlets compared her to serpents, to spiders, to Babylonian harlots. Caricatures filled shop windows. Lola towering above the king, cracking her whip over his bowed head. Lola perched on a throne with Ludwig, kneeling at her feet, crown dangling from her hand. Each insult spread through the streets like wildfire, and yet she laughed. For every mocking sketch, more people whispered her name. Every denunciation made her presence impossible to ignore. Ludwig, blinded by obsession, only adored her more. When ministers complained, he scolded them. When priests thundered against her from pulpits, he declared his devotion unshaken. He gave her a palace, appointed guards to protect her, granted her citizenship, and raised her to the title of Countess of Landsfeld. The speed with which she rose, from wandering dancer to titled Lady, enraged Bavaria's nobility. Families who traced their bloodlines back centuries now found themselves eclipsed by a woman whose ancestry was scandal and invention. But Lola did not stop there. She meddled in politics with a brazenness that left even her allies uneasy. She demanded ministers be dismissed, interfered in appointments, and mocked those who disagreed with her. Ludwig treated her advice as if it came from an oracle. Where she pointed, he followed. His court recoiled in disbelief, but their protests meant nothing. The king's heart had become her stage, and on that stage she performed a role more powerful than any she had played in Paris or Vienna. Her temper, once a rumour, now became legendary. She did not merely argue, she lashed out. The whip she carried was no empty prop. She struck servants who displeased her, courtiers who contradicted her, even officers who failed to show proper respect. Tales spread of her shrieking fury echoing through the palace corridors, of ministers retreating red-faced and humiliated, of noblewomen reduced to tears by her insults. Munich society recoiled in horror, but Ludwig only smiled indulgently, as though her rage were proof of her passion. "Better fire than cold stone," he told one minister who dared complain. "My Lola is alive, the rest of you are corpses." The students of Munich, fiery with revolutionary fervour and outraged at her influence, became her loudest enemies. They mocked her in taverns, sang songs ridiculing her, and hurled insults whenever she appeared in public. Lola, never one to retreat, confronted them. She rode through the streets with her whip ready, daring them to challenge her. Once, when a crowd of students hissed as she passed, she spurred her horse directly into their midst, scattering them in panic as she brandished her whip with triumphant laughter. Word of the incident spread like contagion, transforming her into both villain and legend. The newspapers fueled the fire. Some printed lurid accounts of her dances, describing her spider dance in tones half horrified, half titillated. Others accused her of espionage, claiming she was an agent of foreign powers sent to corrupt Bavaria from within. Cartoons showed her with fangs and talons, clinging to Ludwig's shoulders while he staggered under her weight. Every insult etched her deeper into the public consciousness. She became the embodiment of everything Bavaria despised: foreign, immoral, defiant, corrupt. And still she laughed. For Lola understood a truth few dared speak: to be hated is to be remembered. And in that memory lies power. She fed on outrage, turning it into fuel for her ascendancy. If society recoiled from her, let it recoil harder. If they spat her name in anger, at least they spoke it. Silence was death. Noise was immortality. Yet even Lola could not ignore the rumbling beneath her feet. Bavaria was not Paris. Its patience was thinner, its conservatism sharper, its priests more influential. Each scandal, each insult, each lash of her whip drew Ludwig closer while pushing Bavaria further away. The king's ministers warned him that his subjects despised her, that riots might come. He dismissed them with the stubborn blindness of a man who cannot bear to lose his obsession. At night, in the palace chambers she claimed as her own, Lola revelled in her power. She wore her jewels not as ornaments but as trophies, each one proof of her conquest of a monarch. She lounged in silks, laughing at the fury of ministers, mocking the outrage of priests, savouring the poetry Ludwig wrote in her honour. She had risen from disgrace to dominion, from failed wife to mistress of a king. It was a triumph unlike any Europe had seen and a danger unlike any Bavaria had endured. For while she danced at the centre of the court, the shadows beyond the palace walls deepened. Students plotted, nobles schemed, ministers whispered of resignation, and priests prayed for deliverance. Lola Montez, Countess of Landsfeld, ruled Ludwig's heart with a whip and a smile, but the kingdom she claimed with him seethed like a cauldron, and soon it would boil over. The Lady of Scandal had taken her throne, and Bavaria trembled beneath her feet. The city seethed. To the artisans and merchants of Munich, Lola became a daily provocation. They saw her jewels, her palace, her arrogance, and felt the weight of taxes heavier on their backs. They saw a woman who had given them no loyalty, who was not Bavarian by blood or birth, raised above them as though she were a queen. In taverns, men slammed their mugs down and cursed her name. In churches, priests thundered that the kingdom was bewitched, its king ensnared by a foreign sorceress. Each Sunday, the congregations muttered, the spider," under their breath, as though speaking a prayer against her. But Lola did not hide. She rode daily through the city, her head held high, daring them to confront her. She carried her whip always, the leather coiled like a serpent at her side. Crowds gathered, hissing, jeering, throwing insults that rang sharp as stones. More than once, objects were hurled: rotten fruit, mud, even rocks. Yet Lola never flinched. She cracked her whip, spurred her horse, and rode into the mob with the fury of a general scattering enemies. Each clash became legend. The students, who hated her most, began to chant her name in drunken riots, their shouts echoing through Munich's narrow streets. The king heard their anger but closed his ears. To Ludwig, Lola was not a curse but a revelation. He had written poetry all his life, but she made him believe he was living a poem. "My Lola," he murmured in his chambers, "is my muse, my fire. They hate her because they cannot endure her brilliance." When his ministers begged him to distance himself, he dismissed them. When his family pleaded with him, he turned away. Even his beloved people, whose affection he had once cherished, could not sway him. He belonged to Lola, and through him, Bavaria belonged to her as well. The nobility seethed most of all. Generations of Bavarian lords, schooled in etiquette and armed with pedigrees centuries old, now found themselves mocked and insulted by a woman with neither title nor blood. At dinners, she laughed at their manners. At receptions, she interrupted conversations to belittle them. One baron, so insulted by her words, left Munich altogether, vowing never to return while she remained. Ministers threatened resignation. Judges spoke of leaving their posts. And yet Ludwig only grew more obstinate. The more Bavaria despised her, the more fiercely he clung to her side. Pamphlets multiplied, their ink dripping with venom. Some claimed she had bewitched the king with potions, others that she was an agent of Austria, sent to destabilize Bavaria. One popular cartoon showed Ludwig as a puppet, strings tied to his limbs, while Lola loomed above as a spider, fangs bared, whip in hand. The people laughed bitterly at these images, but Ludwig refused to see the mockery. He tacked her portraits to his walls, recited her praises aloud, and kissed the very whip she wielded as though it were a relic. And Lola herself? She thrived. Each insult confirmed her power, each riot announced her dominance. She believed herself untouchable, and in many ways she was. For while the city roared, she slept in silken chambers, her jewels glimmering in the candlelight, her king kneeling at her feet. What was the fury of a kingdom compared to the devotion of a monarch. She laughed at their hatred, dismissing Bavaria's cries as the whining of children. But even Lola, bold as she was, could not entirely ignore the rumblings beneath the surface. The hatred was too sharp, the resentment too deep. She wielded scandal as a weapon, but scandal cuts both ways. Already, the storm was gathering, its clouds thickening over Munich, darkening the gilded halls of the residence. The Lady of Scandal reigned supreme, but the ground beneath her throne was beginning to crack. The palace windows glowed each night with candlelight, their golden shimmer a beacon in the darkened streets of Munich. Inside, laughter echoed, music played, and Lola Montez held court like a sovereign, her whip gleaming at her side. But outside, the air thickened with hatred. Each glow from the palace seemed less like a light and more like a provocation, a reminder that the king had surrendered his heart, and perhaps his reason, to a woman Bavaria despised. Her enemies multiplied. They gathered in taverns, in lecture halls, in churches. Students, once fiery in their devotion to Ludwig, now spat his name alongside hers. They called her the foreign harlot, the spider queen, the destroyer. In smoky beer halls, young men sang mocking songs about her, verses sharp with venom, choruses punctuated by jeers. Each night, their voices grew louder, and their fists struck tables harder. The rebellion was still only words, but words were becoming weapons. The nobility sharpened their knives in silence. They were men born to power, accustomed to the slow grind of politics, but Lola had made them ridiculous. She insulted their wives, mocked their titles, and dismissed their counsel as if they were children. They endured her lashings in public, but in private, they plotted. They whispered in corridors, exchanged letters heavy with coded resentment, courted foreign allies, and watched for the moment when Ludwig's devotion might weaken. The church, too, moved against her. Bavaria was Catholic to its bones, and priests thundered each Sunday that the kingdom had been profaned. From pulpits, Lola was named Jezebel, Delilah, temptress of kings, corrupter of souls. Parishioners muttered their assent, some crossing themselves at the very mention of her. The bishops, more cautious, sent quiet warnings to the king. This scandal endangered not just his reign, but his very soul. Ludwig ignored them, as he ignored all. His love for Lola was not reasoned, not tempered. It was obsession. And obsession does not yield to sermons. But Lola did not retreat in the face of such opposition. She confronted it. She seemed to grow taller with each insult, fiercer with each attack. When students hissed at her on the streets, she rode her horse into their midst, scattering them with the crack of her whip. When nobles turned their shoulders at court, she laughed and spat her defiance, knowing Ludwig would take her side. When priests condemned her, she mocked their celibacy, declaring in salons that men who feared women could not speak of sin. Each insult hurled at her, she hurled back doubled, her laughter ringing like steel in the air. Munich seethed, yet Ludwig's devotion only grew stronger. He poured out poetry for her, awkward verses scribbled in his own hand, comparing her to goddesses and angels, blind to the irony that his people saw her as demon and witch. He decorated her chambers with costly gifts, jewels glittering like captured stars, silks that draped her body in colour. She was not simply his mistress, she was his muse, his fire, his very reason for enduring the burdens of kingship. But Lola was not content to be muse alone. She demanded power. She wanted a voice in matters of state, wanted her enemies not just silenced but destroyed. She urged Ludwig to dismiss ministers who opposed her, and he obeyed. She called for professors at the university to be expelled when students rioted, and he granted her wish. The more Bavaria resisted her, the more Ludwig sought to prove his loyalty, until the kingdom itself seemed a battlefield between the will of a king and the fury of his subjects. Students became her fiercest foes. In taverns, they plotted not merely insults but action. They organized protests, chanting against her in the streets, their voices swelling until they shook the palace gates. Soldiers dispersed them, but the protests returned, louder, more determined. Pamphlets appeared overnight, pasted. To walls slipped under doors, each one filled with venom. Down with the Spider Queen, down with the Witch of Landsfeld. Save the king, save Bavaria. The court dissolved into factions. Some ministers resigned in disgust, unwilling to serve while Lola reigned. Others stayed, hoping to weather the storm, but their patience frayed. The nobility, humiliated, turned from their monarch. Even Ludwig's own family whispered against him. His son Maximilian the heir regarded Lola with open contempt, and his contempt spread among the people. The dynasty itself began to tremble, its foundations cracked by scandal, and through it all, Lola laughed. She had faced disgrace before and survived. She had been mocked, denounced, shamed, and yet each time she had risen higher. Why should Bavaria be different? She believed herself untouchable, armoured in Ludwig's devotion. The people might curse her, the ministers might plot, but as long as the king adored her, she reigned. Yet in the shadows, her enemies waited. They knew passion could blind a man, but they also knew passion could break him. They saw Ludwig clinging to her with desperation, his credibility collapsing with each decree he signed at her urging. They knew the kingdom could not endure much longer under her reign of scandal, and so they waited, sharpening their knives, biding their time, certain that the storm would soon break. Enemies at every turn, Lola strode proudly, whip in hand, daring the world to strike. But even she could not silence the rumble that grew louder each day, the murmur of revolt swelling into a roar. Bavaria was no longer merely scandalized. It was ready to rise. The city's air thickened with venom. Every corner of Munich became a stage for insult. Beggars spat at her carriage wheels. Children, emboldened by their parents' mutters, threw pebbles at her windows. Market women cursed her under their breath as she passed, clutching their rosaries as if the beads could ward off her presence. The students grew bolder, their mockery turning from whispered jokes to shouted epithets, until Lola could scarcely leave her palace without facing a chorus of jeers. She did not cower. She confronted them with the defiance that had carried her across Europe. When students hissed at her, she cracked her whip in the air, her horse rearing like a beast enraged. When pamphlets slandered her, she tore them down with her own hands, laughing as if to mock their feeble words. She was not afraid of enemies. She had been born into their hatred and had always thrived on it. But this was different. This was not Parisian gossip or Viennese sneers. This was an entire kingdom turning against her, and even Lola could feel the weight of that hatred pressing upon her shoulders. Inside the palace, the atmosphere curdled. Ministers who remained at Ludwig's side did so with reluctance, their loyalty stretched thin. When Lola entered a room, conversation died. Men averted their eyes, women tightened their lips, and servants slipped silently away. She could feel the loathing that pulsed in the air, but she refused to yield to it. She would not bow, not apologize, not soften. To bend even an inch was to admit defeat, and defeat was a language Lola Montez did not speak. But isolation bred paranoia. She began to see enemies in every shadow, traitors in every smile. She accused courtiers of plotting against her, demanded Ludwig dismiss them. She sent spies into taverns to report what students said, and when the reports returned full of mockery and rage, she demanded harsher punishments. Ludwig obeyed, though each act of obedience cost him another measure of his people's love. The nobility tightened their circle. They did not speak her name aloud in Ludwig's presence, but in private salons they conspired. They wrote letters to one another, dripping with contempt, their ink plotting her downfall. Some dreamed of banishment, others whispered of more violent ends, but all agreed that Bavaria he could not endure so long as Lola Montez reigned over the king's heart. Ludwig saw it all unravelling but refused to let go. He clutched Lola with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. The more Bavaria despised her, the more fiercely he proclaimed his devotion. His words grew frantic, his poetry desperate. He called her my saviour, my muse, my eternal flame. But to his ministers and his people those words sounded like madness. They saw not a king, but a man enslaved. And Lola herself, though she laughed and mocked and cracked her whip, must have felt the ground shifting beneath her. Her enemies were everywhere, their shadows lengthening, their whispers louder each day. She had built her reign upon scandal, but scandal was no longer her weapon alone. It had turned against her, spreading like fire she could not control. For the first time, perhaps, Lola Montez stood not merely as a provocateur, but as prey, hunted by a kingdom's wrath. Yet still she strode, head high, whip in hand, daring them to strike her down. For if Lola was to fall, she would fall with a laugh on her lips, and Bavaria in flames at her feet. The winter of 1848 arrived like a crack of thunder. Across Europe the air thickened with smoke and the sound of marching boots. Paris erupted, first barricades of cobblestones rising overnight, musket fire rattling through narrow streets, the monarchy there toppling in a matter of days. From Paris, the fire spread outward like a contagion, leaping from border to border. Vienna shuddered, Berlin shook, Milan roared. It was not war in the old sense, not armies against armies, but the roar of peoples against their rulers, voices raised in unison, demanding freedom, demanding change, demanding blood if need be. And in Munich, when the people searched for the face of their grievances, they found it not only in the figure of King Ludwig, but in the woman at his side. Lola Montez, Countess of Landsfeld, became the lightning rod. Of their hatred, the symbol of corruption and disgrace. She was not merely a mistress now. She was the embodiment of everything they despised: foreignness, arrogance, vice, the mockery of their traditions, the corruption of their king, the streets filled with voices. Students gathered first, their chants echoing off the stone walls. Down with Lola, down with the Spider Queen, down with the whore of Landsfeld. They waved pamphlets like banners, their caricatures of Lola brandished high. Some showed her as a witch stirring a cauldron, Ludwig's crown bubbling inside. Others painted her as a spider, her web spread across Bavaria. The images inflamed the crowds. They laughed bitterly, shouted louder, hurled insults that cracked the air like stones. Soon, it was not only students. Merchants closed their shops, artisans left their workbenches, women leaned from their windows to jeer as Lola's carriage passed. Priests thundered from pulpits, their sermons shaking with fury. Bavaria had turned against her, and Ludwig's stubborn devotion only made the fury greater. Every gift he gave her, every decree he signed at her urging, every step she took into politics was a dagger driven into the kingdom's patience. The riots began as sparks a tavern brawl, a gathering of students, a scuffle with soldiers, but sparks spread. By February, Munich's streets burned with protest. Torches lit the night, smoke curled upward, voices swelled into thunder. Crowds gathered before the palace, their chants pounding like drums. "Expel her! Expel her! Expel her!" Soldiers stood guard at the gates, but their faces were pale, their hands uncertain on their muskets, for many of them too despised her. Inside the palace, Lola raged. She paced her chambers like a lioness, her whip snapping in the air. "Let them howl!" she shouted. "Let them choke on their envy. I will not be driven out like a criminal. I am mistress of Bavaria, and they will learn it." Her fury blazed, but beneath, it flickered a shadow of fear. She had faced scandal before, yes, but this was no single city's gossip. This was an entire kingdom rising against her, an entire people demanding her fall. Ludwig clung to her, desperate. He wrote frantic verses, swore eternal loyalty, kissed her hands until his tears dampened her skin. "They will not take you from me," he vowed. "I will abdicate first. I will abandon throne and crown, but never you." And in that vow lay the seed of his ruin. For his ministers, his nobles, his own family now knew the truth. Ludwig would sacrifice Bavaria itself for Lola Montez. The pressure tightened. Nobles threatened resignation, judges stepped down, professors left their posts. The court dissolved into chaos. Foreign ambassadors whispered their dismay. Bavaria teetered at the edge of collapse. And still Ludwig refused to let her go. The protests swelled into insurrection. Barricades rose in Munich's streets, cobblestones piled high, flags waving above them. Students armed themselves with pistols, artisans with hammers, peasants with pitchforks. The cries grew harsher, louder, echoing through every alley. "Down with Lola! Down with Ludwig! Down with the rotten throne!" At last, the fury broke through the palace gates. Soldiers faltered, unwilling to fire upon their own people, and the mob surged forward. Torches lit the night, flames licking at the palace doors. Inside, Ludwig trembled, torn between devotion and survival. Lola urged him to stand firm, to strike down the rebels, to crush them beneath his soldiers' boots. But the king looked into the faces of his people, heard their voices, voices that had once adored him, and felt his courage shatter. On the 11th of March, 1848, the impossible happened. Under relentless pressure, Ludwig agreed to expel Lola Montez from Bavaria. She raged at the decision, shrieking, cursing, her whip cracking in the air. But the king's resolve, brittle as glass, at last gave way. Guards escorted her. From the palace, the mob howling in triumph as she was driven away. Her reign of scandal was over, but Ludwig did not recover. Without Lola, he was broken, a hollow man. His subjects saw only weakness. Within days, the pressure mounted again, and on the 20th of March, Ludwig I abdicated his throne in favour of his son, Maximilian II. The king, who had built galleries, patronised art, filled Munich with monuments, was reduced to a figure of pity, a monarch undone not by war or famine but by love for a woman who laughed at scandal. And Lola? She vanished into exile, her name still burning on the lips of the people, half curse, half legend. But though she was gone, her shadow lingered. For Bavaria would remember her not as a dancer, not even as a courtesan, but as the woman who toppled a king. The revolution swept onward, leaving ruins in its wake, but in Munich the fire bore her name. The Spider Queen, the Lady of Scandal, the Witch of Landsfeld, Lola Montez. The night Lola was expelled from Munich, the city seemed to heave with relief as though a fever had broken. Crowds surged through the streets, their torches flaring in celebration, their chants rising like a hymn of deliverance. "Lola is gone! Lola is gone!" they cried, their voices echoing against church spires and palace walls. For days afterward, bells rang, sermons thundered, and taverns overflowed with jubilant citizens toasting her downfall. In their eyes, they had cast out the witch who had bewitched their king, saved Bavaria from disgrace, and restored dignity to their nation. But the triumph was stained with violence. Lola's departure was not a graceful retreat, but a flight through jeering crowds. Her carriage lurched along cobbled streets, pelted with rotten fruit, stones, and mud. Windows rattled with the fury of voices calling her name like a curse. Some swore they saw her face at the window, pale but defiant, her lips curled in that mocking half-smile that had maddened kings and courtiers alike. If she feared them, she did not show it. Even as the mob clawed at her carriage, Lola Montez refused to bow. Behind her, the palace stood silent, its candles guttered, its king broken. Ludwig sat alone, his face buried in his hands, his ministers gathered around him like carrion birds. They told him Bavaria was safe now, that the storm had passed, but their voices were knives. He knew what they thought, that he had been a fool, a puppet, a weak man undone by passion. Their pity was worse than their scorn. He muttered Lola's name under his breath like a prayer, a plea, a curse. The revolution raged on. Across Europe, thrones toppled, barricades rose, the very foundations of monarchies trembled. But in Munich, the name of Lola Montez burned hottest of all. She became the emblem of everything the people had fought against: decadence, corruption, foreign influence, scandal. In beer halls and marketplaces, her story was told again and again, each telling darker, more monstrous. Some claimed she had bewitched Ludwig with potions. Others swore she was an agent of Satan, sent to test Bavaria's faith. Mothers warned their daughters that beauty was dangerous, that it could topple kings and damn nations. Lola became less a woman than a myth, a ghost who haunted the ruins of 1848, and yet, for all their hatred, Bavaria could not erase her. Even in her absence, her name lingered like perfume after a lover has gone, both sweet and poisonous. The people had expelled her, but they could not forget her. She had entered their history like a wound that would never fully heal. Lola herself did not look back. She fled Bavaria with fury in her heart, vowing that she would not vanish into silence. If Munich rejected her, the world was still wide. Paris, London, New York, all lay ahead, waiting for her laughter, her whip, her spider dance. She had lost a kingdom, but kingdoms had never been her true aim. What she craved was immortality, and in that she had already succeeded. For even as the bells of Munich tolled in triumph, her name was spoken in whispers, curses, and gasps across Europe. The revolution had expelled her, yes, but it had also crowned her with the darker glory of legend. The palace was silent after Lola's departure, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something broken, a stillness heavy with shame and ruin. King Ludwig I sat in his private chambers, the curtains drawn against the jubilant cries of his people outside. They celebrated as though Bavaria had been saved, but Ludwig felt only the emptiness of loss. His ministers had forced him to choose between his throne and the woman he loved, and though Lola was gone, his crown no longer felt like victory. It felt like ash. The corridors of the residence were filled with whispers. Servants moved like shadows, their eyes downcast, their steps hushed, as if the very walls had ears. Ministers gathered in small knots, their voices low, their glances sharp. The nobility, once proud to linger in Ludwig's presence, now kept their distance. Even his own family regarded him with a cold, brittle pity. His son, Maximilian, the heir, looked upon him with disdain, scarcely veiled, the disgust of a man who believed his father had sullied the dynasty with weakness. And still Ludwig muttered Lola's name. He traced her likeness in sketches, crude but tender, scrawled verses in her honour with trembling hand. He clung to her memory as though it were a talisman against the scorn of the world. Each night he sat among her discarded gowns and jewels, pressing them to his face as though their scent could summon her back. The people might cheer her expulsion, but he remained enslaved to her absence, broken by a passion that would not die. The pressure did not ease. If anything, it grew heavier. The revolution sweeping Europe had not spared Munich. Though Lola was gone, the people demanded more. They wanted reform, liberalization, concessions to their newfound power. They wanted a king who would rule with strength, not weakness. Ludwig, stripped of Lola, had lost the one fire that gave him purpose. He wavered, faltered, clung to fragments of authority that slipped through his fingers like sand. The crowds gathered again, their voices rising in fresh demands. They chanted not only against Lola but against Ludwig himself. Down with the king, down with the tyrant. They called for a constitution, for freedoms, for the old order to crumble. Ludwig, weary and broken, had no strength left to resist. He looked at his crown and saw not glory but burden. He looked at his throne and saw not majesty but mockery. He had given his heart to Lola, and when Bavaria tore her from him, they had torn out his will to rule as well. On the 20th of March 1848, the decision was made. Ludwig I of Bavaria abdicated his throne in favour of his son Maximilian II. The crown that had adorned his head for over 2 decades passed to the heir, and Ludwig stepped down, his reign reduced to a cautionary tale. There was no grand ceremony, no flourish of triumph. It was quiet, subdued, heavy with humiliation. A king had fallen not to an enemy army, not to famine or plague, but to the scandal of a woman who had dared to laugh at the world. Munich roared with approval, the streets filled with celebration, the people toasting Maximilian as though salvation had arrived. But in the shadows, whispers lingered. They said Lola Montez had not only seduced a king but toppled a monarchy, that her web had ensnared not just Ludwig but Bavaria itself. She was gone, yet her ghost clung to every corner of Munich, her laughter echoing in the chambers where Ludwig once held her close. Ludwig retreated into exile, not banished, but diminished. He lived out his days far from power, a poet still, sketching portraits of his beloved Lola, his verses drenched in longing. He never stopped writing her name. To him, she was not the witch or the spider the world had called her, but the fire that had made him feel alive one last time. To his people, he was a king undone by weakness. To himself, he was a man undone by love. And so the throne of Bavaria passed on, but the story of Ludwig's fall remained inseparable from the name of Lola Montez. Together, they became legend, a king who abdicated, a dancer who destroyed, a love story written not in devotion but in ruin. She left Munich under a storm of hatred, her carriage rattling through streets where the people jeered, spat and hurled their curses into the night. The torches of the mob flickered in her wake, their flames dancing like devils rejoicing at her expulsion. But Lola Montez did not weep. She sat upright in the carriage, her chin tilted high, her eyes flashing with the same defiance that had once cowed ministers and infuriated queens. If she trembled, she did not show it. For Lola had lived her life on scandal, and if Bavaria thought to silence her, it was mistaken. She would not vanish, she would not fade. Yet for the first time she had no throne to lean upon. No king to shelter her, no palace to house her, no court to scandalize. She was adrift. The very scandal that had elevated her now barred her from acceptance. Across Europe, her name was infamous. Every newspaper had printed her face in caricature. Every café had muttered her downfall. She was a woman known to all and welcome to none. She turned first to Switzerland, that refuge for the exiled and the disgraced. The mountains rose around her like silent judges. their peaks crowned with snow, their valleys echoing with whispers. She found rooms in lodgings where her presence startled landlords and scandalized fellow tenants. She could not walk the streets without drawing stares, some curious, some hostile, some openly mocking. She had been the mistress of a king. Now she was a fugitive of her own legend. But Lola was not a woman to surrender to obscurity. If Munich had cast her out, she would simply reinvent herself again. She wrote letters to old acquaintances, reached out to admirers in Paris, sought stages where she might perform once more. The spider dance had shocked Europe before perhaps it could shock it again. But audiences no longer looked upon her as a mysterious Spanish dancer. They knew her now as the woman who had toppled a king. The mystique was gone, replaced by ridicule and curiosity. Some came to her performances to see the beauty that had enchanted Ludwig. Others came to mock, to laugh, to jeer. She performed anyway, her skirts swirling, her whip cracking, her defiance blazing. The road stretched onward. Paris received her coldly. Vienna had long since closed its doors. London regarded her with disdain. Wherever she went, whispers followed. There she is, the courtesan, the witch, the ruin of Bavaria. Respectable society barred its doors, but Lola did not beg for their approval. She carried herself with the same imperious pride, her laughter sharp as glass, her beauty fading, but her presence still undeniable. She became less dancer and more spectacle, her name enough to draw crowds whether they adored or despised her. She drifted through Europe like a ghost of scandal, her fortunes dwindling, her lovers fewer, her enemies many. Yet still she travelled, restless, insatiable. For Lola could not remain still. Stillness meant death, obscurity, the only fate she truly feared. And so, when Europe at last grew too hostile, she turned her gaze across the ocean. The New World America, land of reinvention, where fortunes rose overnight and names were written anew. If Europe was done with Lola Montez, America would have her. She sailed west, across the grey Atlantic, her past trailing behind her like a cloak of shadows. On deck, passengers whispered, their eyes darting toward her. Some knew her face, some only her name, but all sensed her presence as something magnetic, dangerous. She stood on the prow with the wind in her hair, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though daring the ocean itself to test her. She had lost a king, lost a crown, lost a throne of scandal, but she had not lost herself. When the shores of America rose before her, Lola Montez smiled. For exile was not an end. It was another stage, and Lola had always known how to dance upon any stage the world offered her. The sea delivered her at last to New York, its harbour bristling with masts, its streets alive with noise, its air thick with the mingled scents of smoke, sweat and ambition. This was not Europe with its gilded salons and rigid hierarchies. America was raw, sprawling, restless. Here fortunes were made in a day and lost by nightfall. Here the past mattered less than the present, and reinvention was not scandal but survival. For Lola Montez, this land was promise a new stage upon which to play her eternal role. But the whispers had crossed the ocean with her. The newspapers knew her name, and they did not forget. They called her the notorious Countess of Landsfeld, the courtesan of Bavaria, the scandal of Europe. Her reputation preceded her like a herald, half damning, half enticing. Crowds came not out of respect but curiosity. Who was this woman who had toppled a king? Was she beauty or fraud, dancer or whore, temptress or ruin? Lola knew how to wield curiosity. She stepped onto American stages with the same imperious air she had carried through Paris and Munich, her skirts swirling, her whip snapping, her spider dance electrifying audiences unused to such audacity. The miners, merchants and gamblers of the New World had never seen anything like her. They roared with delight, shouted with abandon, stamped their boots until the floor shook. Women gasped and turned away, but even as they condemned, they could not stop their husbands from watching. Yet America was not Europe. Its audiences were rougher, its judgments harsher. In San Francisco, where gold fever raged and men outnumbered women 10-1, Lola performed in theatres packed with miners, their faces weathered by dust and greed. They shouted her name, threw gold coins at her feet, demanded encores with drunken fervour. She revelled in their adoration, raising her skirts higher, cracking her whip harder, daring them to keep up with her fire. But behind the cheers lay mockery. To some, she was spectacle, not artist. To others, a fraud wrapped in silks. Newspapers lampooned her, sketching her not as goddess but grotesque, a relic of European scandal washed up on America's shores. Still, she endured. She lectured as well as danced, speaking to curious crowds about her life, her travels, her philosophy of freedom. Some came to mock, others to admire, but all left talking of her. Lola Montez was never invisible. That, above all, she ensured, the gold fields of California offered her a new kind of audience. Rough men who had clawed fortunes from the dirt gathered to see her, hungry for spectacle, eager for scandal. In ramshackle theatres, under lanterns that smoked and flickered, she performed her spider dance as though the very wilderness itself watched. They shouted, stamped, threw nuggets of gold upon the stage. In those moments, Lola was queen again, not of Bavaria, but of miners and dreamers, her throne a rough plank stage, her crown the roar of desperate men. But the years carved lines into her face, dulled the brilliance of her beauty, though not her fire. What had once been alluring now seemed excessive. What had once shocked now seemed tawdry. The same audiences that had roared with delight began to jeer, to mock, to laugh at her, not as temptress, but as has-been. She was still Lola, but the world was changing, and her power was fading. Yet even in decline, she remained defiant. She carried her whip, struck out at hecklers, lashed her tongue at critics. She refused to bow, to soften, to apologize. She had been mistress of a king, destroyer of a throne. She would not whimper into obscurity. If America wanted a spectacle, she would give it to them, even if the spectacle was her own unraveling. In frontier towns, in gold rush camps, in theatres that stank of whiskey and sweat, Lola Montez danced. Her spider dance, scandalous in Europe, became wild in America, skirts flying, laughter ringing, her defiance blazing even as the jeers grew louder. She was both adored and mocked, both queen and fool, but always, always, she was unforgettable. For Lola could not fade. To fade was death, and she would rather die in fire than live in silence. She crossed the oceans again, restless as ever, her legend dragging behind her like a storm cloud. The ship pitched and groaned through southern seas, its decks slick with salt spray, its sails straining against furious winds. But Lola Montez stood on deck, defiant, staring toward the unknown continent that waited at the edge of the earth. Australia, a land of convicts and gold, of dust and fire, where civilization itself seemed a thin crust laid over wildness. If Europe had mocked her, if America had cheered and jeered in equal measure, perhaps here she might find a new stage, a new kingdom of scandal. She arrived in Sydney in 1855, her reputation preceding her like the echo of a whip crack. The newspapers had already painted her in lurid colours, the courtesan of Europe, the mistress who toppled a king, the dancer whose spider dance scandalized and enthralled. Colonial society, clinging desperately to respectability in a land built on exile and crime, was both horrified and fascinated. The miners, rough men who had clawed fortunes from the soil, adored her before she even stepped onto a stage. To them, she was fire incarnate, a woman who embodied the lawlessness of their own lives. Her performances in Sydney were chaos barely contained. She danced as she always had, skirts flying, laughter ringing, her whip slashing the air, but here the boundaries between stage and riot blurred. The miners roared until the rafters shook, throwing coins and bottles alike, stamping their boots until the floorboards quivered. Respectable citizens recoiled in horror, muttering prayers as though the devil herself had arrived. The newspapers condemned her in sermons disguised as reviews, calling her vulgar, obscene, a menace to morality. And still, the theatres filled. Lola thrived on the chaos. She lashed out at hecklers, striking them with her whip from the stage. She hurled insults with the precision of daggers, mocking those who dared to interrupt her. She did not perform for her audience so much as against them, as though each night were a duel. The miners adored it, shouting her name, demanding more. Respectable society shuddered, but they too could not look away. Scandal was her stage, and she played it to perfection. From Sydney, she journeyed to Melbourne, to the goldfields, to towns that rose overnight from dust and greed. She performed in rough halls lit by flickering lamps, her laughter echoing through the smoke and sweat of the frontier. The miners worshipped her, pressing nuggets of gold into her hands, carrying her through the streets on their shoulders. To them, she was not Jezebel or witch, but goddess, proof that even in the wilderness, beauty and scandal could blaze like fire. But colonial authorities were less forgiving. They saw in her a threat to order, a danger to the fragile veneer of respectability they tried to impose upon their wild domain. Police hovered at her performances, magistrates muttered of indecency charges, priests thundered that she would damn the colony's soul. Rumours spread that she had brawled on stage, that she had spat in the face of critics, that she had stormed into taverns brandishing her whip. Some stories were true, others invention, but together they painted a portrait of chaos in petticoats, a tempest no law could contain. Lola seemed to embrace the legend. She toured the outback with the air of a conqueror, leaving behind towns buzzing with scandal, riots of laughter, and outrage trailing in her wake. She was worshipped and despised, adored and condemned. The pattern was familiar, the story she had lived in Europe and America replayed on new soil. But here, at the ends of the earth, it took on an even rawer edge. There were no gilded courts, no salons of poets and nobles, only dust, gold, and the roar of men who lived and died by chance. Her fame in Australia burned bright, but like all flames, it consumed itself quickly. By the late 1852, the novelty waned. Her beauty, though still striking, was fading. Her power, though fierce, began to falter. Crowds grew crueler, laughter sharper. She was still Lola Montez, still unforgettable, but the spell no longer held as firmly. The miners adored her, yes, but colonial society closed its doors, and the authorities eyed her with growing determination. The scandal that had fueled her was also the fire that drove her out. And so, restless as ever, Lola left Australia, her legend trailing behind her like smoke over the goldfields. The miners still sang of her, the priests still cursed her, the newspapers still printed her name. She had left another continent scorched by her presence, another society both enthralled and enraged. But Lola Montez was not finished. She would never be finished until the world itself closed its eyes against her. The stage might change, the audience might shift, but she would continue to dance, to scandalize, to laugh in the face of ruin. For Lola was exile incarnate, a restless flame, and flames do not rest. They burn, and burn, and burn, until nothing remains but ash. Sydney received her as both spectacle and scandal. When Lola first strode onto the stage of the Royal Victoria Theatre in 1855, the audience gasped before she had even lifted a finger. She entered with her hair unpinned, her skirts daringly cut, her whip gleaming under the lamps. She stood still for a moment, savouring their shock, then began to dance. The spider dance, her most infamous creation, unfolded as it had in Europe, skirts lifted, legs revealed, movements that balanced between comic terror and erotic allure. The miners roared approval, stamping their boots until the floorboards shook. Respectable matrons clutched their pearls and fled the hall. The newspapers were merciless the next morning, calling her vulgar, obscene, an outrage against civilization itself. But Lola thrived on outrage. Each condemnation became her advertisement, each denunciation another reason for the curious to crowd her performances. She mocked her critics publicly, calling them hypocrites, cowards, eunuchs. One Sydney journalist, emboldened by public opinion, published a scathing review describing her as a painted wreck of a woman who mistakes notoriety for art. Lola stormed into the newspaper's office, whip in hand, demanding satisfaction. The confrontation became the talk of the colony, Lola shrieking, the journalist retreating behind his desk, clerks scattering in terror. Whether she struck him or merely threatened, the legend grew that she had flogged a critic within an inch of his life. In Melbourne, the response was even more chaotic. The gold rush had filled the city with men who lived hard and spent recklessly, eager for spectacle, thirsty for scandal. Lola gave them both in abundance. Her performances sold out, her name shouted in the streets, her image plastered on playbills that promised fire and daring. She strode into saloons and taverns, drinking alongside miners, laughing louder than their bawdiest songs, cracking her whip across tables for sheer amusement. They adored her for it. She was not some distant star, but one of them wild, unrestrained, unashamed. The goldfields themselves were her truest stage. In Ballarat, Bendigo, Castlemaine towns carved from dust and sweat, she performed in crude halls where miners packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by smoking lamps. Nuggets of gold clinked at her feet as men hurled them in, admiration, eager to see their fortunes glitter in her hands. They carried her through the streets on their shoulders, chanting her name as though she were a queen of the outback. In those moments, Lola Montez, once the courtesan of kings, ruled a kingdom of miners and misfits, her crown fashioned from their drunken devotion. But her reign was turbulent. The same fire that drew crowds also burned bridges. She insulted officials, mocked magistrates, brawled with hecklers. One tale, half legend, half truth told, of Lola storming from the stage mid-performance to confront a man who had jeered too loudly. She cracked her whip across his shoulders, then returned to the boards as though nothing had happened, the miners howling with delight. Another story claimed she once overturned a lamp in her fury, nearly setting a hall ablaze before the crowd stamped out the flames with their boots. Whether true or not, these stories spread like wildfire, fueling her legend as the tempest of the colonies. Colonial society recoiled. Respectable families barred her from their parlours. Clergymen thundered that she was the devil's emissary, sent to drag the young men of Australia into damnation. Magistrates discussed charges of obscenity, though none dared risk the miners' wrath by moving against her. For Lola had the mob on her side, rough men who adored her wildness and would defend her with fists and blades if need be. She was both scandal and queen, damned in drawing rooms but worshipped in taverns. Yet the tide turned, as it always did. Her beauty, though still fierce, was no longer unassailable. The years of travel, scandal, and defiance etched themselves into her face, dimmed the brilliance that had once enthralled kings. Audiences who had once roared with delight began to laugh cruelly, jeering not in admiration, but in mockery. The miners' devotion cooled as new spectacles arrived, fresher and less infamous. Newspapers no longer treated her as dangerous, but as pathetic, a fallen woman clinging to past glories. Her temper grew sharper as her fortunes waned. She lashed out more often, striking hecklers, insulting audiences, storming from stages. Each outburst tarnished her further, until even her most ardent supporters began to turn away. She had burned brightly, but now the fire consumed itself. By the late 1852, Lola's time in Australia was finished. She had conquered the goldfields, scandalized the cities, left a trail of stories that would linger for decades, tales of whips and riots, of laughter and ruin. But the colony had grown tired of her. Respectability closed in, law hardened, scandal ceased to be enough, and Lola Montez, restless spirit, could not remain where she was no longer queen. She departed as she had arrived defiantly, with her head held high, her enemies cursing her name, her admirers toasting her memory. Behind her, Australia buzzed with stories of her, stories that grew in the telling. To some she was a devil, to others a goddess, to all unforgettable. And so she sailed again, her legend trailing behind her like smoke over the goldfields, her laughter echoing across oceans. She had ruled Bavaria's court, America's frontier, and Australia's outback. But the fire that burned within her could not be contained by continents. She would keep moving, keep burning, until the world itself grew tired of her blaze. The years caught up with her like wolves on a fading trail. Lola Montez, once the blaze of Europe's salons, once the scourge of Bavaria, once the tempest of America's frontier and Australia's goldfields, found herself dwindling. The fire still flared within her, but the world no longer fed it. Her beauty, that dangerous weapon she had wielded like a sword, began to dull. Lines etched themselves across her face, her hair thinned, her eyes, though still fierce, carried shadows of exhaustion. She returned to America in the late 1852, restless as ever, but the reception was not what it had once been. She gave lectures now, no longer content or perhaps no longer able to rely solely on her spider dance. She stood on stages in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, speaking of her life, her travels, her philosophy of freedom. Audiences came out of curiosity, for who could resist hearing the voice of the woman who had brought down a king? But the halls were not always full, and the applause not always warm. Some listened with fascination, others with derision. She was a relic of scandal, a curiosity fading into parody. Still she pressed on, her pride unbroken. She told stories of Ludwig with laughter in her voice, mocking the ministers who had despised her, dismissing the riots that had demanded her exile. Yet beneath the bravado lingered something softer, a wistful tone when she spoke of her lost crown, a sigh when she recalled the fire of youth. For the first time, perhaps, Lola Montez seemed aware of time's cruelty. Her health began to fail. The years of wandering, the endless battles, the strain of scandal wore upon her body. She coughed often, her breath shallow, her strength waning. Doctors muttered of pneumonia, of paralysis, of the toll taken by years lived at too high a pitch. Still, she refused to bow. She carried herself with the same imperious air, though her body betrayed her. She travelled less, performed rarely, lectured when she could, but the stages grew smaller, the audiences fewer. By the dawn of the 1860s, she had settled in New York. The city, vast and restless, barely noticed her now. She lived in modest lodgings, far from the palaces and theatres that had once been her domain. Gone were the jewels, the gowns, the entourages. She walked the streets cloaked in anonymity, though her name was still whispered in corners, her legend still alive in rumour, if not in reality. It was in these final years that a strange transformation overtook her. The woman who had defied priests, mocked morality, and cracked her whip at kings, turned suddenly toward religion. She attended church services, prayed, even spoke of repentance. Some said it was fear of death that drove her. Others whispered that scandal had finally broken her spirit. But perhaps it was simply another reinvention, the final role she chose to play. If society had always cast her as Jezebel, perhaps she would end as Magdalene. She gave herself to small acts of charity, visiting the poor, offering what little comfort she could. She who had once bathed in jewels now washed the feet of beggars. She who had once mocked the faithful now whispered prayers beside their beds. The transformation shocked those who had known her, but Lola seemed to embrace it fully. Her fire had not gone out, it had merely changed colour, burning now with a softer glow, like embers before the night consumes them. In January of 1861, pneumonia struck her down. She lay in her modest New York lodging, the city's noise drifting faintly through the window. She was only 39 years old, but her body was spent, her spirit weary. No courtiers surrounded her, no lovers, no kings, only a handful of acquaintances and the echo of her own legend. On the 17th of January, Lola Montez died. Her funeral was small, almost anonymous. A few mourners gathered, some curious, some faithful, some who had known her only in her final repentant guise. There were no processions, no banners, no crowds. She was buried quietly in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, the earth closing over her as though swallowing the scandal that had once shaken kingdoms. Yet she did not vanish. Legends rarely do. Her story lingered, whispered in saloons and drawing rooms, printed in newspapers, embroidered into tales that grew wilder with each telling. To some, she remained the witch who had bewitched a king. To others, the courtesan who had danced her way across continents. To still others, she was a tragic figure, a woman too restless for her own time, punished for daring to live without apology. Her grave bore only her name, but her true monument was the scandal she left behind. A king abdicated, a dynasty shaken, continents scorched by her presence. Lola Montez had burned brightly, and though the flame was gone, the smoke lingered, curling through history, refusing to disperse. When Lola Montez was driven from Munich, Bavaria roared with triumph, but inside the residence, the halls echoed with silence. King Ludwig I, who had once walked proudly through those chambers surrounded by ministers, nobles, and the hum of admiration, now wandered alone. The courtiers who remained treated him with brittle respect, their bows stiff, their eyes filled with veiled contempt. He was still a king in name, but the aura of majesty had fled. And Ludwig, though he still wore velvet and jewels, carried himself as though he were already in exile. He had promised Lola he would never abandon her, had sworn he would rather cast aside his crown than live without her, and in the end, both promises came true. On the 20th of March 1848, less than 2 weeks after her banishment, Ludwig abdicated. The pressure of the revolution, the hatred of his people, the demands of his nobles, and the loss of his mistress broke what remained of his will. He placed the crown in the hands of his son, Maximilian II, and stepped away from the throne he had adorned for 23 years. The abdication was quiet, almost perfunctory. No grand speeches, no stirring farewells. Ludwig signed the documents with trembling hands, his eyes clouded with sorrow, while Maximilian stood stiff and unsmiling beside him. Outside, the people celebrated not only Lola's expulsion, but the downfall of the king who had allowed her to reign over their lives. Bells rang, crowds filled the streets, taverns overflowed. They toasted Maximilian, their new monarch, as though youth itself might cleanse the kingdom of scandal. Ludwig's name became a sneer, an old fool undone by lust, a warning whispered in taverns and lecture halls. But Ludwig did not vanish. He retreated to private residences, away from Munich's streets, away from the roar of the people who had once adored him. He lived on for nearly 2 decades more, an exile within his own country. His power gone, his reputation ruined, he turned inward to poetry, to sketching, to memories, and above all, to Lola. He never ceased to write her name. Page after page of his journals filled with verses dedicated to her, crude drawings of her face, notes recalling their moments together. To his ministers, to his children, to his people, she had been a curse. To Ludwig, she remained the fire that had illuminated his final years. "My Lola," he wrote, "was truth itself, though the world could not endure her, even in disgrace, even stripped of crown and throne. He clung to her, as though she were the only piece of his life that still held meaning. The years weighed heavily upon him. He aged rapidly after abdication. His shoulders stooped, his hair whitening, his eyes sunken. The grandeur of his reign faded into memory, the monuments he had built standing as cold reminders of what had been. Tourists walked through his gallery of beauties, pointing at the portraits of Munich's fairest women. But for Ludwig there was only one face that mattered: Lola's. He sketched her again and again, as if repetition might summon her back, as if paper and ink could restore the flesh he had lost. His family tolerated him but did not honour him. Maximilian ruled with the caution his father had lacked, restoring some measure of stability to Bavaria. To him, Lola was an obscenity, a stain upon the dynasty. He forbade her name in his presence, though he could not erase her from memory. For the people of Bavaria, she was inseparable from Ludwig's fall, and Ludwig himself seemed determined to prove them right by never letting her ghost rest. Visitors who saw him in these years described a man both dignified and broken. He still dressed in fine clothes, still carried himself with the remnants of majesty, but his speech often drifted into rambling recollections of Lola. He showed sketches of her to anyone who would look, recited verses aloud, his voice trembling with emotion. Some pitied him, others mocked him, but all recognized the tragedy. A king who had lost not only his throne but his place in history, reduced to the shadow of a woman's memory. He lived long enough to hear of her death. In 1861, when word reached him that Lola Montez had died in New York at the age of 39, Ludwig locked himself in his chamber for days. When he emerged, his eyes were red, his hands trembling. He wrote verse after verse, elegies for the woman who had once sat at his side, who had driven his people to rebellion, who had ruined him and yet made him feel alive. Her grave was thousands of miles away, but in his mind she was with him still, her laughter echoing through his solitude. Ludwig died in 1868, 20 years after his abdication. He was 76, a man who had once ruled a kingdom but ended his life as a relic of scandal. At his funeral, Bavaria remembered him with restraint, neither vilifying nor glorifying him. His legacy was tangled. He had adorned Munich with art and architecture, enriched its culture, and yet had nearly destroyed its monarchy for the sake of a single woman. But to those who whispered in the corners, to those who knew his heart, he was remembered for one thing above all. He had loved Lola Montez beyond reason, beyond dignity, beyond salvation. And so the king without a throne became inseparable from the dancer without a crown. Together they lingered in memory, their names entwined, their story less history than myth. For even as monuments crumbled and dynasties shifted, the tale of Ludwig and Lola endured a tragedy of desire and ruin, of passion that toppled kingdoms, of a love that burned until it consumed everything it touched. History rarely remembers the truth. It remembers stories. And in the telling, those stories twist, darken and glow with the strange fire of myth. Lola Montez, born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in a quiet corner of Ireland, might have passed through life as a forgotten wife, a cast-off girl marked by scandal. Instead, she chose reinvention. and for that choice, she became immortal. But what was she, truly? A courtesan who deceived kings? A dancer whose art was more provocation than talent? A witch, as priests claimed, who bewitched a monarch into ruin? Or was she something else, a woman too wild for the narrow cage of her century, punished not for her sins but for her refusal to kneel? In the salons of Europe, her name was spoken in gasps, half curse, half fascination. In Munich, her portrait was burned in effigy, her memory spat upon even as it lingered in whispers. In America and Australia, she was spectacle and scandal, adored by miners, mocked by society. And in the quiet cemeteries of Brooklyn, where her bones lie beneath modest earth, her ghost dances still, refusing to be silenced. The myth of Lola Montez is not simple. Legends grew around her like vines, twisting truth into grotesque or wondrous shapes. Some said she carried a whip always, lashing men like a dominatrix of fate. Some claimed she poisoned rivals, that she cast spells, that she danced not with spiders but with demons clinging to her skirts. Others swore she had the soul of a saint, that in her final years she repented, gave charity, and died purified. Which was true, perhaps all, perhaps none. For Lola was an actress upon the stage of life itself, and every mask she wore was both false and real. To Bavaria she was ruin incarnate. Ludwig I, once a monarch beloved for his patronage of the arts, became a laughingstock, his abdication etched forever to her name. She was Jezebel, they said, who toppled a king not with armies but with a glance. She was the foreign poison in their Catholic bloodstream, the harlot who had mocked their nobles, the witch who had made their king weep like a boy. For them, Lola Montez was a cautionary tale, proof that passion is weakness, and that women who refuse obedience bring only disaster. But to others, she was something more dangerous and more inspiring. In her audacity lay a kind of freedom. She rejected the suffocating decorum of her age, laughed at propriety, refused to be silent. She claimed her body as her weapon, her laughter as her shield, her scandal as her throne. She dared to speak in rooms where women were meant only to listen, dared to strike when men expected submission, dared to reinvent herself again and again when society demanded ruin. Was she courtesan or artist, destroyer or heroine? The answer depends not on history but on the eye of the beholder. Her myth endures because it is a mirror. Men see in her the dangers of desire, women the dangers of defiance. To the pious, she is a warning. To the rebellious, an icon. Even now, her name stirs unease, for she represents the truth society fears, that a single woman, armed with nothing but beauty and will, can bring kingdoms to their knees. And what of Ludwig, the king without a throne? He died sketching her face, whispering her name, his legacy forever chained to hers. They are bound together in memory, two figures dancing across history's stage, he the monarch undone by passion, she the dancer who turned scandal into empire. Neither could exist in memory without the other. Their story is not love but tragedy, not devotion but obsession, not triumph but ruin. Yet it is precisely ruin that gives it power. For in ruin lies drama, and in drama, immortality. In the end, Lola Montez became what she always sought, unforgettable. Her grave may be modest, her body long dissolved into earth, but her legend still strides across centuries. She is the whisper in the gallery of beauties, the shadow in Bavaria's throne room, the laugh that echoes through gold-rush saloons. She is myth, fire, ghost. And if you listen closely, in the silence between heartbeats, you may hear the faint crack of a whip and the rustle of skirts, the spider dancer still performing in the darkened corners of history, eternal, defiant, unrepentant. The curtain falls, the stage empties, but Lola Montez remains. Yet history is never content to leave such figures in silence. It gnaws at them, reshapes them, turns them into symbols far beyond their mortal flesh. Lola Montez became more than a dancer, more than a courtesan, more than a scandal. She became a story told by others, rewritten in every generation, each retelling revealing less of the woman and more of the teller. Victorian moralists cast her as a warning, the fallen woman, the temptress who destroyed not only herself but those who yielded to her. To them, she was sin in silk, proof that beauty was dangerous when ungoverned by obedience. They turned her into a parable for daughters, muttering her name as though invoking a curse. "Do not be like Lola," they warned, "or you too shall burn." But radicals and bohemians whispered of her differently. To them, Lola was freedom itself. She had refused to bow, refused to apologize, refused to let men dictate her fate. She had taken lovers as men did, wielded scandal as her power, mocked propriety to its face. Yes, she fell, but she fell laughing, her whip cracking until the end. To women chafing under corsets and sermons, her story glowed like a forbidden lantern in the dark, a woman who lived as she pleased, whatever the cost. Modern historians wrestle with her, torn between fact and legend. The documents are scattered, contradictory, coloured by hatred and fascination alike. Was her spider dance truly obscene, or was it exaggerated by prudes eager to condemn? Was she Ludwig's destroyer, or merely the excuse his enemies seized upon during a revolutionary storm that would have toppled him regardless? Was she courtesan, spy, artist, or fraud? The truth slips like water through the fingers. Perhaps that is the secret of her immortality. She cannot be pinned down. She is myth because she is unfixed, forever shifting, forever elusive, and so her ghost lingers in contradictions. She is the courtesan who preached morality in her final years, the witch who prayed at altars, the temptress who gave charity to the poor, the destroyer of kings who died almost forgotten in a modest New York lodging. Her story cannot be caged by one truth, because Lola herself refused cages in life. She was always in motion, fleeing, reinventing, laughing, burning. Walk through the streets of Munich today, and her shadow is there still. The residence where Ludwig trembled still stands, its stones steeped in the memory of her laughter. In Bavaria's taverns, her name is sometimes whispered, half in mockery, half in awe. In Australia, miners' songs and legends still recall the woman who cracked her whip across the Outback stage. In America, her grave at Greenwood Cemetery bears no crown, no jewels, no throne, only her name. Yet visitors still leave flowers, as though the spider dancer might rise again with a laugh, demanding the world remember her, for she is remembered. Not as she truly was, perhaps, but as something greater, a story that refuses to die. Lola Montez, temptress, destroyer, witch, saint, rebel, courtesan, dancer. She is all and none. She is the eternal reminder that passion topples reason, that obsession ruins crowns, that women who refuse silence carve their names into stone whether the world wills it or not. The curtain falls, yes, but listen. In the hush of the theatre of history, a faint sound lingers. A whip cracks, skirts swirl, laughter echoes in defiance, and the spider dancer still weaves her web, immortal in ruin, eternal in myth.